Manitoba plant lovers are about to become a whole lot more knowledgeable about the natural growth in our province. The Manitoba Museum is sharing a brand new book chronicling all of the flora found across Manitoba. It's called, fittingly, Manitoba Flora, a guide to the vascular plants of Manitoba. It was curated by the museum's botany curator, Diana Bizecki Robson. Diana joins us now. Good morning and congratulations on this new book.
Good morning, and thank you so much. I'm very, very pleased to be done volume one of the book.
I believe it. It sounds as though this book was quite a few years in the making. Maybe you can take us back to the genesis of this project and when was the last time a comprehensive book like this was released about Manitoba's flora?
Well, the very first Manitoba Flora, it was called Flora of Manitoba, was published by Homer Scoggin back in 1957.
Wow.
And so when I came to Manitoba to start my job as a curator here almost 23 years ago, I would use that book to identify the plants that I was seeing. But after a while, I noticed something was wrong. There were actually species that were missing from it. And in fact, there's been about 300 species that have been scientifically documented in Manitoba since the 50s. So that's about almost two plants every year since then. So it was and a lot of them were fairly rare. So it was really difficult for scientists who need to identify plants, particularly rare ones, if they're doing any kind of environmental surveys. It was just, increasingly difficult for people to find the resources they needed to identify all the plants that were here. So this book was, part of that whole process to, let people know that these plants were out there.
That is such an incredible undertaking, then, I would imagine. How many years and how much planning has gone into this project for you?
Well, I really started some of the serious work for it back in 2018 when I started doing some field surveys to try to find what we call historic plants. So they're plants that have been collected, like decades ago that nobody has seen since. So I went out to the habitats where these plants grew, where we had a record of them to try to find them again. Unfortunately, most of the time I was unsuccessful, but in a few cases there were plants that had been collected maybe back in the 50s, and I actually was able to find it again. So it's like we know for sure that plant's still growing here. It's not extirpated. And then I was doing a lot of a lot of herbarium work, studying the stuff in our collection. Sorry, I got a bit of a hoarse
Wow.
voice.
Not at all. It sounds as though this is like such a monumental undertaking. You mentioned 250 species that haven't been documented since the 50s, this last sort of collection. This is a very daunting task. How much work does it then take to ensure that this new collection, Manitoba Flora, is up to date and comprehensive? And what's the process for ensuring that amount of quality and scientific rigor?
Well, one of the great things we have here at the museum is what's called a herbarium, which is a collection of preserved plants. And they're from all parts, all over the province. Some of them have been collected in the 1800s, some of them, just a few years ago. And and so I've been actually pulling out all of our old specimens and re-examining them, making sure they're identified correctly. So, because in some cases they might have been identified incorrectly, or they might have been identified using old references, and maybe there's a new name. One of the things that's happened since sort of the DNA revolution happened is that scientists began studying the genetics of plants, and they realized that some plants that we thought were actually related to each other are not. And so there's been changes in the names. In some cases, the whole genus changed. We used to call a lot of our orchids used to be in the genus Habenaria, and they've actually switched over to the genus Platanthera, partly because of all of that genetic work. So far I've probably examined over 20,000 plant specimens, either me or my volunteers.
Wow.
in our herbarium. So yeah, it's been a huge undertaking, but it's also a great opportunity for us to update our herbarium so that it's more usable by scientists and more accurate.
Not to mention the scientists notwithstanding, you also had a team of volunteer botanists helping out, I understand, with
Yes.
this project. What was their role in helping to coordinate all of the different plant species that are in this new book? And what's then your role in coordinating them?
Well, one of the whole section on ferns was really done by the late Dr. Richard Staniforth. So he was a University of Winnipeg professor. He was the curator of the herbarium there. And after he retired, his retirement project was just to map and study all of the ferns and the fern-like plants. And so he traveled all over the province and found even new species of ferns that we didn't know were here. And so a lot of that section is based on his work. Sadly, he passed away a few years ago, but it's nice to be able to bring his work forward. And then some of the other volunteers, I've just had a lot of like professional botanists who don't have a lot of work to do over the winter, and they agreed to come in and look at some of the harder
Mhm.
groups. And sometimes there'd be a group of plants that I was like, I feel like there's probably some misidentifications in that folder. So if you could
Sure.
look at it for me, I'd, yeah, sort of be directing them towards the families that were most problematic and getting them to look at
Mhm.
them.
In observing all these new plants that have been a part of Manitoba's floral ecosystem over the last 7 decades or so, since the 1950s, and I'm using Manitoba floral ecosystem very broadly because, of course, there's so many different ecosystems that exist within Manitoba. What sorts of things are you noticing more broadly about the natural health of our province when it comes to studying these plants and specifically the new species that are being discovered?
Well, a lot of the rarest plants are, I guess, unsurprisingly, in the prairie ecosystem, and that's because there's been a lot of habitat loss. So, in a lot of cases, when I would go out to areas where I knew a rare plant had been collected, maybe back in the 50s, I just wouldn't find any native prairie in that area at all.
Hmm.
It often was invaded by non-native species. So smooth brome, for example, is a grass that was brought over from Europe. And part of the reason why we brought it is because it helped to stabilize soils during the 1930s. And they've since then they've really spread, and most of the ditches are now full of smooth brome, and also quackgrass is very common. And there used to be native grasses that were growing in those areas, and they pretty much seem to be gone. Um, so really, some of those species are just left in the remaining, really good chunks of native prairie, but you don't really
Hmm.
find them more casually growing in any kind of disturbed area like a ditch or at the edges of crop fields or things like that. So,
Okay.
yeah, there's been a lot of invasive species moving into
Sure.
Manitoba.
So, given that, maybe in the last little bit of our time together here, what do you hope that Manitobans take away about the natural flora in our province and the role that it plays in, well, our day to day lives?
Well, I think a lot of people look at plants and they just see a big green blur. And one of the
Hmm.
things that I wanted to get across in this book is that plants have just some amazingly intricate details to them. There's actually a whole section in the book on plant terminology, and it talks about the different parts of plants and how they actually look different, and how if you just pay a little bit of attention to the edges of the leaves or the textures of the leaves, you can actually tell these different species apart. And I think we're in a day and age when people are probably spending a little bit too much time online. And it's
Mm.
important for our mental health to spend more time in nature. Lots of studies out there show that nature is very beneficial. It helps lower blood pressure, all sorts of things. And And so with this book, I'm hoping to encourage people to, hey, maybe you can spend a little bit more time in nature. Maybe you want to take a notebook with you and do some sketching. And if you're so inclined, there are websites like iNaturalist, for example, where you can take pictures
Mm,
of plants and actually post them. And that iNaturalist data is actually used by scientists to help understand plant distribution. So if people really want to, do something useful with their time instead of endlessly scrolling,
yeah.
helping scientists understand, the rarity of plants in the province is a great thing to do.
I think so as well, and people will certainly be inspired to do that when they read this new book, Manitoba Flora, A Guide to the Vascular Plants of Manitoba, available for pre-order in book and ebook form as well. It's been so wonderful hearing about this book and your work to create it. Diana Bizecki Robson, thank you so much for joining us here on Classic 107.
Thank you so much, Nolan, for having me.